Hello, everyone, and thanks for joining us for today's webcast. We'll be talking about critical infrastructure, related compliance and security concerns, smart grid, and home appliances gone bad. And you'll hear more about that particular topic in a minute. My name is Todd Harris, Industry Marketing at Q1 Labs, and I'm joined by Chris Poulin, Q1 Labs Chief Security Officer, and David Swift, Solutions Architect from our partner Accuvant. Before we get rolling, I have a few housekeeping items. All lines are on mute. The webcast is being recorded, and we will have the recorded version available on Q1 Labs in the next 24 hours, on q1labs.com, that is. Questions can be submitted via the GoToWebinar Q&A interface in the right-hand panel. You can do that at any time. I will be checking the chat out and the Q&A, so I may be answering things as you submit them. I will hold some of the questions till the end for both Chris and David. If you're on Twitter, please feel free to follow the hashtag and to use the hashtag Q1Energy to ask questions, make comments, and tweet with your peers that might also be on the webcast and those that might not. So we've got a lot of content to move through, and I think we should get started. Chris Poulin will be going first. So, Chris, it is all yours.
Great. Well, welcome, everyone, and glad to have you with us. I'm going to talk a little bit about smart grid security, just to sort of preface things. So it is going to be more, more focused, and then I'll turn it over to David, and David's going to talk about critical infrastructure as a whole, focusing in, I believe, on SCADA systems. I won't speak for him. With that said, let's get started. So let me paint a picture here first. Let's talk about, I want to talk about smart grid and smart homes and how that all applies to security. So imagine a guy stuck in traffic. He's on his way to work, right? And he takes off his eyes off the phone to look at his eyes off the road to look at his phone real quick. And he starts thinking, geez, did I leave the fridge open back at home? So it turns out that he has a home automation app on his smartphone, and so he clicks on it, and he wants to see what's happening in his house. And on his smartphone, he gets status of everything, and it looks like the fridge is fine. His house is absolutely perfect. There's no extra lights on, and he's all happy, right? So, he just sort of rolls his eyes and he grins. He's OCD. I mean, I've done it too. Turned around and gone back home to see if the iron is on, right? But the reality is that back at home, somebody has actually hacked into his system because it is a smart grid and it's connected to the internet. And the refrigerator is actually, at this point in time, spitting ice cubes on the floor. It's actually turned off the power to the freezer, and it's also kicking up the temperature to the regular refrigerator and starting to freeze everything that's in there. Not only that, but the dishwasher is starting to spill out over the floor, and the toaster is starting to kick out flames. And not only that, but he happens to have a Roombot, which is being remote controlled, and it's kicking up against the table that the toaster is sitting on and pushing it up against the curtains, and everything's going up in smoke at this point. So the question is that really a movie scene scenario, or is it reality? And so, to a certain extent, I think of it this way, right? Jules Verne was kind of a crazy guy, right, back in his time, but it turns out that a lot of the predictions that he made are actual technology that's happening today. And then again, for those of you who are Stephen King fans and have seen Maximum Overdrive, there's very little likelihood that a truck is actually going to come to life and terrorize people at a truck stop. So, which is it? And that's the question, right? So before we get started into the security of smart grid itself and what to be worried about, we should probably level set with what it means. What is a power grid? And just from a very high level, setting the expectation of what the components are, you've got things that generate power: coal plants, nuclear plants, hydroelectric dams, everything that you think of from a generation that have turbines that kick out electricity. All of that actually goes into the power transmission lines, right? So, and those actually go through substations and into the lines, which we call power distribution, and those lines go into your houses and to the consumer premise. So that's where you plug stuff in and you turn it on, right? So just quickly going back, there's power generation, then there's the transmission lines, which have high voltage transmission to the substations, which actually transform it down into the distribution grid, which are the power lines that are that you see going into your houses. Something interesting about power, it's and any of you who have done any electric work, you're familiar with the analogy of power is like running water, right? So if you think about power as water entering a pipe and then it continues to flow through until it spills out the back end. Same thing is true with electricity. When you generate it, it actually has to continue flowing until it goes to ground. Something that's different about power, between power and water, is that power, if you shut off the faucet, it doesn't just stand still in the pipes. It needs to keep flowing. However, you can store electricity in batteries. It is something I'll talk about real quick here in a second. What are the goals of the smart grid itself? And why even have a smart grid in the first place? So the goal here, there are a few, and I'll go touch on them very quickly, is to have better interconnection of generation, power generation, generators of all sizes and technology. And when we start thinking about that, it's more than just coal-powered plants. It's also, for example, wind farms and solar energy, et cetera, et cetera. Another goal of the smart grid is to give consumers the ability to actually optimize the system and give them the ability to choose where they actually get their power supply. So the consumers themselves, and I'll talk about that a little bit more, but consumers actually are critical in deciding how power comes to them. So that's one of the goals, but also to improve the reliability and the quality of the power supply. So the actual providers of electricity want to be able to route electricity where it's needed, when it's needed. So to a large extent, if you think about why that happens, we talk about rolling blackouts in California, for example. One of the reasons that happens is that the power grid gets overloaded. So what they end up doing is they'll actually black out certain sections so that there's more power to the sections that are still available. That is a tactical response to not really having the appropriate telemetry, not being able to find out how electricity is being used on the distribution side, right? So it turns out that the grid, the owners of the grid, actually have pretty good telemetry on the transmission side. They know how power is flowing from the generation to the substations, but they don't have great telemetry on the distribution side. So what's happening on the, what are consumers using the electricity for? Plus, if you think about it, consumers are, their entropy to the electrical system, turning things on, turning them off at will. There is no control at that point. So telemetry is how power companies decide or monitor and decide how to reroute their electricity. It also allows the power companies to do essentially to make smarter upgrade decisions, to understand what consumers are using electricity for and how they're using it. So what that means in terms of actual monitoring is that it's the primary component are smart meters. So it is essentially what we're calling advanced metering infrastructure, or AMI, and that is contrasted with what we think of as traditional meters. So remember the guy who used to walk up to your house once a month with a pad in his hand and actually read the meter that way. And then those guys got tired of being bitten by dogs, so they basically put a remote reading radios or some sort of, I'm not entirely sure what they are, but some way for them to remotely read the meters. They could just drive by and actually look at them. So what happens with smart meters is even more advanced, because now it's connected to to some data transmission line. And I'll talk about that in a moment. But what that essentially in that data transmission line is not just for reading. It's also so that the power companies can send information and controls back to the smart meters themselves. The way that actually works, and this will be relevant in a second, is that the smart meters, how do they get back to the providers at this point? There's a number of ways, but the primary way right now that they're being deployed is through radio frequency. So what will end up happening is that the smart meters will talk to each other and basically send their information along. So, you know, in the last 15 minutes, the consumers use this much electricity. They'll send it on to the next meter, the next one, the next one, until it gets to one that's actually within a transmission, or within to a transmission or a receiver, pardon me, for all that telemetry that's connected back to some data cable, and then it can get back to the smart or to the power, the electric company, essentially. Okay. So another goal of the smart grid is that we talk about distribution side power. So think about consumers who have photoelectric cells or solar panels on their roofs. They also may have the capability to do wind farms. They may have some sort of wind generation turbine or something like that. So that actually is another goal of the smart grid, is so that consumers can actually send that electricity, do power generation from the distribution side as opposed to the transmission side. And actually, they can create microgrids. So think about a neighborhood where everyone decides to it'd be a great idea to put solar panels on their house. They can actually create what is essentially a small little electric company, and then they can sell that electric power back to the company itself, which can redistribute it through the distribution side. So those are a lot of pieces, right? It's sort of a Lego set of what does the smart grid really mean. And so what does that mean in the future? What's the entire smart grid going to look like? And the truth is no one really knows. It's just like the cloud. We understand that there are some benefits to it, and consumers want it and power companies want it. But what is it actually going to look like when it's fully fleshed out? So it turns out right now, Europe, Italy, and the UK actually have a fairly well-deployed smart grid, but it's generally more for telemetry gathering and some distribution-side power generation, but they haven't fully realized the entire benefit. So we're still in the initial stages of what does the smart grid look like. So from the actual power company side, aside from just getting power and getting more telemetry, what can we do with that kind of telemetry? And the reality is what they're looking for is what we're calling wide area situational awareness. So there's something called synchrophasers, which I won't go into, but essentially gives the power company the ability to find out from the transmission side what the usage is. So now they're getting more telemetry, right, all the way down to the consumer premise. They can also now start overlaying geographic information on top of the telemetry and demographic information. You know, what's the demographic makeup of the neighborhood? What's the weather pattern like? They could even overlay intelligence data, like take in feeds from DHS and say, hey, we know that there is a threat against Northern California. So you can actually overlay that type of data as well and make smart decisions about what to do with the power. From an operational perspective, of course, the power companies want to be able to detect and mitigate problems. So, you know, in other words, they want to be able to see where there's too much power being used or where there's a break in the power lines on the transmission side. And then, of course, there's security, right? So, which is basically that they can feed that information into they can both take information from, for example, the Department of Homeland Security, but also feed that information back into them. So let me give you a couple of quick examples. You know, so for example, if there's a cloudy day when less energy is actually generated, right? So from the solar panels, but it turns out that the consumers don't need that much energy because it's a cloudy day and they don't need their air conditioners running. Then the power companies can regulate the amount of power they send to different areas. So where it's shady, they don't need to send as much power, and they can reroute more power to the places that are hot and sunny where they know there's going to be more air conditioning. Also, and this slide's a little bit early, but privately or electric vehicles, PEVs, are coming. They're coming now, and a lot of people are buying them. It turns out those things generate about twice the amount of electricity when you're charging them. So they consume about twice the amount of electricity that's used from an air conditioning unit in a normal home. So let's say everyone in an affluent neighborhood has decided to buy one of these electric vehicles. So they show up from work at 5 o'clock, because we all get out at 5 o'clock, right? So we all show up at the same time. They probably should change that to 8 o'clock. No one works till 5 anymore. So they all show up at the same time at home, and they plug in their electric vehicles. All of a sudden, there's a big drain on the grid. Another thing that the power companies can do is they can, and we talked about rolling blackouts, but they can also shut off priority 3 devices, like pool pumps as needed. So they can actually make decisions. And again, this goes back to the two-way communication to smart meters and how the power company can not only monitor but regulate the amount of electricity. So I've talked a lot about the things that are on the slide, but I think the thing that's most important is that it doesn't just stop at the smart meter. It also continues into the home. So consumers are going to have home area networks. And it's what I alluded to in the fictitious scenario at the beginning of the slide show, which is basically that customers are going to have the ability to connect their smart home information and connect their appliances into essentially what's a home area network, which reports to the smart meter and then goes back to the electric company. This also opens up the opportunity for third-party monitoring services to actually gain that telemetry and help customers to make decisions about what to do with it. So, for example, they could have profiles that say, turn on my dishwasher at 2 in the morning when the price of power is low because the demand is low, or set up a profile because I'm a green conscious consumer, and I'm concerned about energy saving and saving the environment rather than saving myself money. So there are ways that you can set profiles that do that through your home area network, and it's all enabled through the smart grid. I talked a lot about this. I'm just going to blast through this slide because I need to give David some room here. I have lots to say, and I want to make sure that I cede the floor. So let's talk about something that's more interesting, which is, okay, now we understand what the smart grid does. What are the benefits? But what are the attacks and the vulnerabilities that are happening? So the first one that the utility companies that are most concerned about is consumer fraud, right? So think about this. You've got a smart meter attached to your home, and your neighbor goes on vacation. So we know that the neighbor is using less electricity probably than you are if you're sitting at your home looking at his through binoculars and you know that he's not there. So the smart meters are actually tagged with an ID that's associated with the home. So, your neighbor who's on vacation is 1, 2, 3, 4. Yours is 5, 6, 7, 8. So what you do is you go over to his, you swap the 2 meters, so that now, whenever the smart meter reports back to the company, the power company, with your ID, 5, 6, 7, 8, it's actually attached to his house, and he's on vacation, so you're using less electricity. So people actually do this kind of stuff, by the way. They swap meters. Another thing that consumers try to do is prevent the smart meters from reporting back. So the ones that use RF, there are consumers who actually stick coffee cans on top of them to keep the radio frequency signal from being able to leave the smart meter. They'll also put EMF bags, or otherwise known as Faraday sacks, on top of them, and it basically keeps the RF information from going through them. You can actually buy Faraday sacks online, by the way, if you're curious. Other things that people have been doing for a long time, this is not necessarily new to smart meters, is they actually take jumper cables and they'll jump the meter itself. So from outside, from the power source itself outside your home to the inside of the house. And there are people who get pretty creative with that, right? So a full meter bypass is going to generate 0 amount of traffic, electricity usage. But if you allow some of it to occur, then you're actually showing that you are using some electricity, but it's not as much as you actually are. People are also pretty smart. They'll put magnets on the side of the meter. So even the smart meters, most of them, if not all of them now, have the little rotating disc that you're used to when you look at a utility meter. So they'll put a magnet on there, and those discs are made out of metal. So what that does, it effectively slows down the little rotating drum, which shows less usage than you actually have. People actually will also drill holes in the bottom of the meters and stick screwdrivers up in there or something just to put some friction on that little disc and keep that from running as well. So it's interesting because there's some of this is smart meter based, some of it's not, but smart meters actually help the companies because if there's no meter data, then obviously something's wrong, right? So the utility companies are just going to basically charge based upon your historical average until they send somebody out and find out what you've done to tamper with that thing. The second thing is that if you have a drop that occurs over time, so they do monitor this, and this goes to correlation of usage. They'll actually find out, okay, well, you used X amount of electricity for the last 6 months, and all of a sudden you've had a 3-month drop. So what they'll do is they'll look at that, and they'll look at your payment history, and if you have had a history of poor payment, then that actually leads to the conclusion that you're probably tampering with it, and they'll send somebody out to see what's going on with that meter. So smart meters actually provide, and that sort of telemetry provides an interesting way for utility companies to avoid fraud or to combat fraud. There are some other interesting weaknesses. It's not particularly attack, but one of the things that smart meters do is they look for blackouts in an area. And the way that the smart meters talk RF to RF can actually cause a problem because they sort of, what they'll do is they'll send back an event saying, hey, I've lost power. And it's sort of their last dying gasp as they send it from meter to meter. Well, if the meters at the beginning and the center of the blackout can't report or their signal gets lost in between meters, then what ends up happening is the utility company sees this big ring of blackout on the periphery of a blackout, but they don't have any information about the center of it. So it's something they call a black hole syndrome when power goes out.
So that's from smart meter perspective. Looking at it from a bigger, from a larger utility, critical infrastructure perspective, what has happened from, here's some notable hacks. Back in 2000, there was a kid in Australia, I believe he's a college student, or no, he's a disgruntled worker, I believe, who basically managed to hack into the SCADA system for water services, and he opened up floodgates that allowed raw sewage to spill out into waterways, and it found its way to park grounds and the grounds of a hotel. So a little bit of tampering. Scary though, he could potentially have opened up the floodgates into the drinking water itself, right? And of course, we all know about Stuxnet. I'm not going to bash you over the head with that particular story again, but we understand that that is both a SCADA-based attack, an automated attack, and also attacked the energy sector. So if you all are interested in that and you don't know about Stuxnet, you're certainly willing to, we can talk about that later on, but I'm going to move on from that in the interest of time. The CIA also, so there were a few disruptions that happened in South America, and it was basically electric was being knocked out. So the CIA actually has claimed that that was a cyber attack with extortion demands. Now that hasn't been corroborated, but it certainly brings up the point that it's possible that we know that the critical infrastructure does have its weaknesses or its vulnerabilities. And so whether it was an attacker or whether it was just some sort of weather incident, which is what they claimed, what the power companies claimed themselves, we know that it's possible that people can get in. And in fact, there was an informal report in 2009 by some security agencies that claimed that the U.S. electrical grid had been penetrated, and it had been for up to 5 years and mapped by Russia and China, and they theorized that there is some time bomb software left behind in our power grid. And finally, IOActive, who are security researchers, have they actually wrote a proof of concept worm that attacked some smart meters, and it basically propagated throughout an entire smart meter infrastructure where they actually owned it. So they could send false information from the smart grid, and they could also send control information to it to shut off power to homes. So we do know that the attacks are possible. Now the good news is that the smart grids, what they do is they send out lots of event information, and we can feed that into a SIM. So obviously we're highly interested in correlating events and SIM information. And they produce some interesting events such as, the battery went dead or the power went out, or tampering has been detected, right? Somebody pried one of the controls off of a smart meter. So you can use that information and basically monitor and look for anomalous events, and you can actually look for things that follow each other. So the power went out on a particular smart meter, and then the battery went dead, and then it was just reconnected within a minute, but no other smart meters in the neighborhood had that same problem. So that could be an isolated incident, which might be indicative of tampering. So one last thing that I'm going to jump into from a smart grid perspective is that one of the problems with it is that there is information that's being sent to the utility companies. So it's more than just your name and telephone number. It's also things that it's what you use to, or it's information about how you use power, right? So and that opens up the capability for side channel attacks, which I'll talk about in a second. But it also, because we have both data and power coming from the same place now, and there's the capability to control power, the utility companies have now created, let's say they have 20 million users or consumers, there are now 20,000 theoretical points of entry back into the utility company. So it makes them more vulnerable instead of just one internet presence, right? And so I always like to think about it in this term. Everybody I know has botnets on their home computers, right? Or all my friends and family who ask me to go over and clean up their computer have been infected by something. So now think about those same consumers being connected directly to the, or indirectly anyway, to the grid itself. So consumer awareness is one of the keys to combating that. When you think about it's a new horizon, or it's a new frontier for utility companies. They're used to thinking of things in a different way than we are as security professionals. We think about them as confidentiality, integrity, availability. They've always been concerned about availability, getting power to the homes. And then second is integrity. So it's an accuracy of information. So getting data back to say, hey, look, don't touch this line because it's energized, right? And then finally, confidentiality is not something they've thought about as much as they need to now. So utility companies have to think more and more about confidentiality because all this information is coming in from consumers. One of the things they can actually do, which I find fascinating, is a side channel attack, which is you can actually tell by the amount. So if you think about telemetry that they were getting in the past, it's been on a monthly basis or at most probably a weekly basis. Now we can do it on a near real-time basis, although they do tend to get it on a 15-minute increment. So what you can do is say, look, I saw all this pattern of usage, and that means over time, and I can correlate it to time of day, et cetera, that's when Chris used his electric razor in the morning. That's when his coffee pot went on. To the point where, if you're really sophisticated, you might even be able to tell what someone's watching on TV just by the pattern of usage of electricity that comes out of it. So there is, in fact, there was an article about that not too long ago. So now that information is going out to power companies, so that's something consumers have to be absolutely concerned about. And in fact, it'll be going out to other third-party monitoring services. Google used to have PowerMeter. That's now retired, but there's a bunch of other third-party monitoring services that are stepping up to fill in the gap. And I'm going to jump past because I think I've kind of overstayed my time here, but I just want to leave you my portion with these thoughts, right? So critical infrastructure is a hot target. We absolutely know that, and the smart grid has benefits, but it does introduce new risks, and it's going to it affects consumers and it affects the grid providers themselves. We're actually bringing the grid providers into unfamiliar territory, which obviously it introduces new risk not just to the grid itself, but also to the consumers. So, and to that extent, right, more information being provided gives more ability for the bad guys to have intelligence gathering. And then, of course, as we talked about, the smart grid itself is not only at risk from the bad guys, but also consumers, which makes it kind of interesting. So it turns out that smart grid vendors, so the real takeaway is that smart grid vendors need to be highly aware of this, and they need to build security in from the very start. I've said this about the cloud for about a year and a half now. I predict there's going to be a major hack on the cloud because it was built without security being the foundation. Well, there is security in it, but it hasn't been the security that we need, which is security for consumer data. It's security around their own cloud. So the smart grid, I think, has the same danger associated, the same risk associated with it, which is that they need to build in security for not just their own infrastructure, but also for consumer protection and for the protection of the greater good. So that's my view on smart grid, and with that, I'm going to turn it over to David Swift.
Chris, that's great. David, let me pass this over to you 1 second here. All right, you should have it now.
No worries. So my slides are a little bit more tactical and not quite as high level as Chris's. I am a geek. I admit it. I am a propeller head. Done 30-plus certifications now, and I've done 50-plus SIM implementations. We have multiple customers at Accuvant right now who are doing smart meter deployments across the country. Worked with 7 of the largest energy companies in the last year, really deploying SIM, really deploying visibility tools so you can tell what's going on in your network. And I tried to pick a couple of areas that my energy customers have been very focused on that have been their biggest concerns. Obviously with Stuxnet, advanced persistent threats came out, and Stuxnet is not even close to the only one. A recent customer on the East Coast, we found a whole set using SIM of devices that were doing based on URL filtering and their proxy. We were seeing all this traffic headed to a site in Australia, which was a friendly company for this particular customer, but it was actually going to a .ru network hosted in Australia. We found 6 devices that were compromised. So bringing in a tool like QRadar and really deploying a SIM properly, starting to look at visibility, can help you find those advanced persistent threats, can help you find those machines that may have been compromised. And the challenge is we're pressed more and more to look at things from a network layer to be able to provide security. There is no antivirus you can install on your smart meter. We're dealing with things that are non-traditional security devices, whether it's SCADA or whether it's some other control network. And my favorite is probably Anheuser-Busch. Anheuser-Busch up in St. Louis runs a network that all IP-enabled devices now that controls the brewing. That's about $2 million a vat for yeast production, and a production that if you're down for more than 2 hours, you've got to throw out all the ingredients and lose $2 million. And a lot of people missed their beer that weekend. So as we start protecting these things, we have to find ways to add visibility at the network layer when we won't necessarily have source data or source controls and protections on these smart meters. APTs are one of those common things. So one of the things we'll talk about is some ways we can use a SIM to detect those. And of course, compliance is driving a big portion of what we're doing these days with SIM, whether we're dealing with NERC, FERC, NRC, SOX, PCI. Somewhere in the network, you've probably got a compliance regulation, and most likely it's going to require a centralized log management. And they don't specify that you have to have a SIM, but they do pretty well specify that you absolutely have to have a centralized management log source, and you have to review those logs in a timely fashion. The challenge is, and my apologies here, there we go. Slides are going a little bit faster or slower depending on network latency. The challenge is we don't have a lot of data. We don't have your traditional antivirus data. We don't have traditional IDS signatures for the attacks that are going in against these devices. So with the SIM, what we can do is overlay context. One provider out on the West Coast right now, one of the things we do is add a whole set of these smart meters IP addresses to a reference list, a function within QRadar that says if they're on this list, these are the machines that are in maintenance mode this week. We know we've got truck rolls to go out and fix these. Don't give me red alerts and page my analyst to go out and start investigating something, because we know these guys are there. We want to start overlaying context. We want to either look at geo-IP addresses for those companies that are only US-based. It's very easy to spot quick wins to look for things that are headed out to the RBN, those Russian addresses, or headed out to Iran or Iraq. And you would be shocked, I think, if you haven't already looked at how many foreign sources are into these networks these days. One of the first reports I try to produce out of the SIM is to get management awareness that simply shows how many IP addresses are actually inbound and allowed through our defenses, through our firewall, through our IDS, using SIM to say, came through one of these sources, it was a non-US based address, and it was coming into and was actually allowed past our defenses. That is usually quite eye-opening. I can tell you for customer after customer, that's usually the first piece where all of a sudden management takes off and says, yes, security actually is relevant. Yes, we actually are under attack, and now we get it because we can see it. You will pry SIM from my cold dead hands if I had to do network security. It is the difference between being blind and having a view into what's really happening. Now, to make SIM effective, though, we have to start overlaying as much information as we can to make that data useful. So as we build out things like the network hierarchy within QRadar, we can define that this IP address range is on the second floor in the building in Dallas, Texas, or it happens to be on the first floor of a remote office in Alabama. Making that quick overlay helps a security analyst quickly triage and decide, is the event relevant? For instance, NetBIOS traffic, internal to internal address, low threat. I'm not too worried about it. NetBIOS traffic, internal address to an external address, oh God, my firewall rules just crapped out, and I'm letting NetBIOS and Windows File Service protocols out to the internet. I've got a serious problem. So we want to start overlaying that information so we can quickly triage. I start with two general goals on SIM to make it useful. First, we're looking for a 4-9 reduction in events to correlated actual actionable events. I want to take 1 million events inbound, raw events, firewall allows, firewall drops, IDS events, antivirus events, smart meter events, and reduce it by 99.99%. For every 1 million, I put out 10 events of interest, 10 offenses in QRadar that the SOC analysts have to look at. That should be our first goal. Qualify. Let's look for the real threats. Let's triage and get down to where at least the fires are running. And yes, we are probably going to have some false negatives, but the idea is if we continue to improve our defenses, we'll start with the ones that are flaming and on fire and put those out. And slowly, as we clean up the misconfigurations and as we clean up the worst offenses, we'll start getting a cleaner and cleaner network. Now, the second piece to that 4 nines of correlation effectiveness, the other thing we're looking for, and we're getting there by adding all this context, the GeoIP information, which comes standard with QRadar, using reference lists to put things like the FBI watch list. Most of my energy companies these days are required to report back for events that came from a certain set of IP addresses provided by an FBI watch list. Well, I can put that in a nice reference list. I can create a custom DSM, take a text file, parse it, drop it into a reference list, and then I can watch for and report on anything that matches that reference list. I would caution you to look carefully at that FBI list, because the last one that I saw actually had loopback 127001 on there, and one of the default Yahoo search servers. I'm like, great, if these guys are on my watch list, I'm going to give you 8 million events a month. But consider pruning it, but we need to add that context to get to that 4 nines of correlation. The other reason we're adding that context is to make it actually relevant. We're trying to make sure we enrich the event with as much information as possible so the analyst can triage it without going to 10 different tools. When done right, the SIM should be your single pane of glass for your security events. It should give you enough information without hitting 10 other tools to figure out whether that's an actual attack or whether it's noise or a misconfiguration, and it should be directly actionable. Now, in terms of some things we can do to find some of this stuff, to find these APTs, to find the malware that may be in our network, one of the most useful sources, and I come from an IDS, IPS background. I used to think it was the be-all, end-all, and learned later on when I was bringing everything into SIM that if it wasn't in a signature, no matter how much the IDS vendors told me it had heuristics and behavioral anomaly detection, it was really 90% signature-based. So looking at those firewall events, the simple, and we have to log allows to be able to get what's really going on, not just the drops, but doing some firewall analysis, understanding the source of where that traffic came from and where it's destined to, I can find a great deal of those APTs. What we're looking for is things that are going out to known malware sites. So we can bring in any one of those and compare in default with QRadar the remote networks list. The DShield list is on there, a list of command and control centers. So as we watch for things that either were allowed from a known malware source into our network, and I want to caution, I'm going to only do the allows. If it was dropped, cool. I don't have to wake up my SOC analyst because my defenses did their job. It's the allows that really concern me, and it's why I have to log the allows. Conversely, if I see a machine trying to call home to a site in Russia, Iran, Tajikistan, you name it, any other country or any other known malware site, I want to report on that so that I can look for those machines that may have already been compromised or may have been compromised in another way. It could have been a USB firmware update that included malware. It could have been something else that came internally onto that machine, and now it's trying to call home and spread its infection. One of the pluses from a security perspective is that at least today, 90+% of the attacks that are out there are sloppy. They don't target a given IP address. They have a reconnaissance phase. And we'll see lots of firewall drops. We'll see lots of firewall allows. For instance, consider what a normal desktop or smart meter should talk to. Probably only having 2 or 3 conversations. The mail server, the file server, in the case of the smart meters, the upstream centralized collector for those events. If all of a sudden a given IP address starts having another 100 conversations with unique destination IP addresses, which we can frequently see through the firewall, we got a problem. If that machine's not a server, he just started trying to spread his love. And odds are I didn't want it spread. From an IDS, IPS perspective, as we start to have better and better signatures, we can start seeing some of these and detect these here. What we want to look for is the things that typically we've tuned out in IDS. Over the years, we've gotten so tired of IDS false positives, we've tuned down the policies and we're only logging a very small set of what it's capable of logging. We start to lose context. What I'm talking about context is when I look at an IDS, IPS event, if I'm logging all of those low-level events, things like traditional IDS event that we would turn off would be things like instant message allowed. I apologize, my slides are jumping around a little bit. So typical IDS event, we've got an instant message logon. Load threat, probably not important unless you've got a policy that says you're not allowed to do instant messaging. We've probably even turned off logging on our IDS. We usually go back and turn it back on. Because instant message logon followed by a file download, followed by an antivirus event, now I've got a problem. And that's where we need a correlation engine in a SIEM like QRadar. This is what we can get if you look for these patterns. We needed that visibility, and we started turning on a whole series of signatures that were really low threats according to the vendors, so that we get enough context to tell where it came from. In this pattern example, I see that IAM logon, I see the file download. Well, now I know where that file came from. I can see the source IP address of where that download came from. I know the file name, and I can fuzz the logic to say, all right, is there anybody else that's talking to that same IP network? And I'm usually going to go with a /24 CIDR block. If they are, they may be infected too. Let's do a little more analysis. Let's look for the ones that they weren't necessarily detected but are following the same type of pattern. Alternatively, I can go back and I can look for any machine, and this happened with a large defense contractor recently I was working with doing incident response remediation. They had been attacked. It was an APT that had blown out their network. And we had to figure out what the file patterns were, what the registry entry keys were, and do a little bit of analysis on hundreds and hundreds of machines to figure out, did this file exist? Did this registry entry change exist? If it did, it probably indicated the machine was problematic. But one of the first triggers to tell us that that machine is likely to be a problem that we would pull in, because they had a network of about 50,000 machines, we obviously couldn't pull all 50,000 in, was to look for any traffic outbound to known CIDR blocks that were problematic. Here again, the place where we can use the reference list feature within QRadar to start getting some of that, and use the remote networks feature within QRadar to help us overlay that context and know about who those attackers are. I work with lots of different SIEM platforms, and I can tell you I really like that remote network feature and that subscription piece that comes with QRadar. So that I already have my evilware blacklist built into it, and I've got some context right off the bat. Other things we can look for. As a general rule, everything counts in large amounts. Seems trivial, but it does tend to hold true. A single firewall drop, there's no way we can investigate every firewall drop on our network. But if I start putting thresholds on it, and I say, if there are 100 firewall drops from the same source within 1 minute, why? Some of these are going to be misconfigurations, and I'll tell you my favorite is Apple devices that have drops on NTP protocol, port 123, headed out to California. Every single Apple seems to want to dial home for time back to MAC headquarters. Well, that's a misconfiguration. That's not a problem. But let's say I see 100 firewall drops from the same source address to the same source port on 300 machines in a 1 minute interval. Either I've got malware, or that machine thinks it's trying to be a server, and I've got a router misconfiguration or firewall misconfiguration, and I better clean it up so I can get rid of. The idea here is to burn off all the wheat so we can get down to those needles. Burn the hay, find the needles in that haystack. Trivial, I know it sounds trite, but really everything does count in large amounts. The converse holds true. The same principle holds true when I'm looking at IDS. A single device with low-level IDS signatures, instant message logons, instant message file transfers. A single one of those, I don't care about. A few hundred different signatures from the same device, and my general rule is about 10. My threshold of pain is pretty low. If I see 10 different unique IDS signatures, whether they were high threats or low threats from the same device in a 1 minute interval, I'm very nervous about that. I want to investigate that machine. SIEM tools give us that ability. They give us the ability to automate those rules and to automate those things that we've learned over time investigating these problems that have been in our network. Before we were looking at ARP tables on routers. We were manually doing greps on logs. Now we have that visibility, and we can automate our logic into the tool to find this stuff. Particularly as we deal with devices that have fewer and fewer security controls and are things like smart meters that really have no No hard drive that we can really load antivirus on, nothing that we can put whitelisting like BIP9 on and lock down. We have to be able to look at these from a network perspective and find these through context. Another baseline, improve your defenses iteratively. We're never going to start with a perfect network, and the chances are we can't make a million changes at once. But a baseline is to go out and run for every security device, provide oversight. I can tell you my #1 favorite on misdeployed security devices these days is host intrusion prevention systems. I'll go out and run a volume and variety log report that says how many unique IP addresses reported in sending a HIP signature this month. Okay, I find a network of 5,000 machines only had 100 unique IP addresses report in. Unlikely then that HIPS is well deployed to all of those machines. The other iteration of that report that helps really narrow down our defenses, I can run that same report and say, by signature, by SSH buffer overflow, how many of these did I see this month? I see 10 million. Chances are the signature is crappy and I can't do anything about it. I see 10, and they all came from the source IP address. There's an IP address I want to investigate and clean up. And there's a signature that I can probably block and improve my defenses overall for next month. Lather, rinse, repeat. Just keep doing it, and eventually we start improving our overall defenses so that we are detecting these things and we are blocking a significant higher number of these. Relative to compliance, and I'm not going to belabor compliance too much, but this is the strategy that I follow that I found very effective with our customers. Find your scope. Our biggest problem is when they come to IT, we have 8,000 IP addresses, and nobody said, these machines, this IP address range is in scope for NERC. These aren't. They're desktops. So defining our scope helps us narrow down our cost, lower our cost of protection, lower the amount of high threats that we have to respond to, and will really help you long-term in making sure your defenses are focused and you're spending your budget where you should. Define events of interest, and I actually hand these to my auditors. I'll go through on my SIM, define the correlations that I think are key, write them up as events of interest. They're not threats, and I won't use them as, I won't define them as threats yet. I won't define them as incidents yet. They're events of interest. They're things that need to be investigated. That remaining 0.01% of our raw events that were identified through correlations as being potentially problematic. We define those. We have it ready as a page to give to our auditors. And we say, this is what we consider a threat in our network, because the verbiage in compliance usually says you must monitor for threats and respond in a timely fashion. But it doesn't define what a threat is. I don't like to let my auditors define what a threat is. I want to define it beforehand and say these are the key correlation rules. This is what we're responding. I apologize, is that my time? And I'm now being informed I'm out of time.
No, David, you're okay. Just keep going.
No worries. I'm just hearing beeping.
Yeah, me too.
So the next thing I want to do is take those events of interest and define our policies. What do we do if we see that particular event of interest? So it's our standard operating procedures and our incident handling policy that says if I see this particular event that I've defined previously in my EOIs, this is what we do. This is what my SOC analysts, this is the process they're going to follow for each one of those. Compliance auditors love it when you follow a standard process. And if you can show that you followed a standard process, they're usually very happy with you. As long as in that standard operating procedure I define my service level agreements for each one of these that say, and in some cases it says, for instance, firewall drops from the outside world. It says best effort basis, low threat. Doesn't mean I have to follow up on every one of them. It said it was a best effort basis. I've defined what my timeline is to respond to these. Again, it usually works for auditors, and if they can then follow your audit trail and show that you have followed your standard processes and closed those events within that time frame that you previously defined, they're like, cool, great, you're doing exactly what you said. And you've made my life easier as an auditor, and I'm a certified auditor, because you've told me what you considered a threat, rather than making me tell you what it was and go out and search the whole world. Last but not least, so after we maintain our audit trail showing we followed our process, is create a record of authority document that says this is how long we store the events. This is where they're stored. This is the IP address range that's in scope for us and how long we're storing each one of these events. My dad's a corporate attorney, and I'll tell you a standard process, a standard ploy from attorneys is to subpoena every possible thing that you have. So if you haven't purged your records at the end of that record of authority time, at the end of your retention period, they can subpoena every single event that you have on your network, and they'll do it just to make your life miserable and just to make discovery more expensive, so you're more likely to settle. Having been on the back end of one of those lawsuits where I was required to produce reams and reams of printed, absolutely useless data, I can tell you, you want to make your life as painless as possible and produce as little data as possible, but still meet your compliance rate. So a data destruction policy is a way to actually help minimize your litigation costs, and I would strongly recommend it. And we link that to our record of authority document. How long do we retain it for each IP? I can get into some specifics on each one of these, but this is the slide set that I wanted to cover. The rest I wanted to be available to you guys for reference if there were other questions that you wanted. There's a best practice document that actually has links to some of the SANS papers that are out there that really cover, and I think I've lost control. So Todd, I'm assuming you're driving now?
If you want to point to something else, David, feel free.
No worries. I was just going to show a best practice document that covers these policies in more detail.
Sure, go ahead.
And that's part of the slide presentation. So it'll be available out on QRadar's website. If you have questions, if you want to dive deeper into NERC compliance, I'd be glad to. For instance, there are some little gotchas in NERC about you must make sure every log source has reported in, and we have no more than a 7-day gap in logs for critical infrastructure devices. And that's one of those little gotchas that we can write some good content in QRadar to watch for, report on, and really help your life. It'll make your life a lot easier in the compliance world. Thanks for your time.
Great, thanks, David. So we've got a few questions. I think we have time for a couple of questions. These could really be pointed at either David or Chris, so guys, feel free to banter back and forth, whatever you like. I'll throw out the first one here. At what level should logging be taking place? Many smart meters and similar devices don't have robust logging capabilities built in. How do you deal with that?
Well, I'll try to field that. I can tell you that logging, these days ICON seems to be the smart meter of choice. Chris and I were talking about this before the presentation started. We've got customers with anywhere from 5 to 20 million smart meters deployed out there. We've been writing a lot of custom DSMs these days to parse that data. We're looking for that device to report a heartbeat. Most of them can report a heartbeat. I want to make sure that that heartbeat is seen within a 24-hour period if the device is in maintenance mode. I report that it's down, and I may not have good telemetry data. I may not know what to charge the client, and I may lose money. That's one, but I can tell you specifically within Itron, I could give you a whole list of what they are. There are about 50 different things that you need to log, and each smart meter has different logging capabilities. A lot of these have an underlying Unix kernel, and the syslog levels, traditional syslog levels, range from 1 to 7. Level 5, or facility 5, tends to be the one that picks up the authentication data and picks up all of the access events, which is the standard level that I'm looking for if it's a Unix-based OS, and I have no other indication of what to log.
Okay. Here's a real brief question. What about IPv4 and IPv6?
Well,
how open-ended is that one?
All the smart meters I've seen have been IPv4. They haven't been v6 enabled yet, which is fortunate given that the IPv6 defenses, particularly IDS and some of the firewall like Palo Alto that are application aware, start to have issues as we're running over IPv6. Chris, do you have a different take on it?
No, actually that's true. So it depends upon the reporting devices, obviously, but you know, at least from our perspective, QRadar, we've been supporting IPv6 for 2-3 years now, anyway, if not more. So we capture IPv4 and v6 information, post-NAT, pre-NAT, and we capture both of them because for devices that run Teredo, obviously they're going to have both an IPv4 and v6 address. So, yep, it's all capable. You can write rules around it. It's a beautiful thing.
And what I would tell you with respect to IPv6 is that I disable it on any device that doesn't absolutely have to have it, which is 99% of my network, because I don't want that as an attack vector, as an attack surface for my devices.
Brilliant point. Yep, agreed.
Cool. So here's another question. Chris, maybe this is for you. Question is, do you work with device manufacturers for reporting in your SIM? So I guess maybe this goes back to the slides where you referenced Itron. Maybe you want to expand a little bit on how we work with some of these device manufacturers?
Sure, it's interesting because, and I guess it goes to show how the SIM industry has matured because, you know, years ago we would have to go approach different manufacturers and say, look, we want to create a partnership with you and we want some of your logs and we want you to tell us how your logs are constructed so that we can create our own parsers. And then we used to have to call them every month or every quarter and say, hey, did you change your log format? But things have turned around now where manufacturers actually want to create partnerships with us, and so they will actually feed their logs to us. We actually have a program called SIP, Security Intelligence Partner Program, where the vendors will actually, when they change their they'll actually feed it into our format, and when they change their logs, they proactively do it. So a lot of times we'll approach different vendors. You know, Itron is a great example since we'll use them as the poster child on this call. And basically they were very interested, so they they provide logs to us in a format that's digestible. So it turns out the industry it's turning around, and SIM is becoming more of the cornerstone of security, of the security program. And so absolutely, when we encounter a manufacturer that is well adopted within our customer base, we definitely create a partnership with them and support their logs out of the box.
The other thing I would tell you about reporting, these days, particularly with smart meters, the focus has been more on network operations type functions, system up, down, how many nodes are down in a given region, and those are things that we can produce fairly handily with QRadar. It's not quite the traditional SOC role, that security role, but more of a NOC role, and don't let SIM fool you, it can do both.
Absolutely.
All right, guys, so we are running short on time. I think we should probably wrap it up at this point. To the audience, just a quick comment. There's a few more questions still queued up. What we'll do is we'll get back to you, most likely privately after this, and make sure we have some answers for you. Just a reminder, we will have this recorded and available on q1labs.com in the next 24 hours. You can reach us with any questions at info@q1labs.com, and you can find us on Twitter. Our handle is @q1labs, and Accuvant's handle is @Accuvant. So as I said, that's about all the time we have. Chris and David, thank you guys so much. It was a great presentation. And to the audience, thank you for jumping on and spending an hour with us, and thanks for the questions.
Yeah, thanks everyone. Cheers. David?
All right, everybody.
Fantastic.
Have a good day.